Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the weight of the most unforgettable stories. And what began as a moment of embarrassment for a little girl sitting on the cracked steps of her schoolyard turned into a tale that people would whisper about. For years, though nobody that morning could have imagined it. The air was heavy with the kind of laughter that cuts deeper than any blade, because it wasn't the laughter of joy, but the cruel, mocking sound that children can sometimes unleash when they see someone weaker, different, or simply standing out in ways they cannot understand. A group of kids had circled around a girl whose shoelaces trailed along the dusty ground, her head lowered, her hands trembling as she tried desperately to knot them, but couldn't seem to get it right. Her shoes were worn out, the fabric fraying at the edges, and every time she bent down to fix them, another wave of snickers rose from the crowd. "Can't even tie her own shoes," one boy said, his tone dripping with ridicule, while another added, "Bet she wears them like that on purpose because that's all she's got." And though their words were sharp, what hurt the most was how they were accompanied by that careless, dismissive laughter, the kind that isolates you from the rest of the world. Yet in that instant, when humiliation seemed unbearable, and her eyes stung with tears she didn't want to shed, a figure who had been walking past the playground stopped in his tracks. He wasn't just anyone. He was a man dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, the kind that seemed far too out of place in that dusty neighborhood, with polished shoes that had likely never seen dirt until today. His presence was commanding, his age betrayed by the silver, streaks in his hair and his eyes sharp but kind, the eyes of someone used to both power and attention. Without a word, he approached the circle of children, their giggles dying down as they noticed him. The little girl kept her gaze fixed on her shoes, too humiliated to notice who had stopped beside her until she heard the sudden silence, a silence so strange it almost frightened her. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the man in the fine suit, whose name was whispered in corporate towers, whose face had graced magazines, and whose fortune could buy entire blocks of the very neighborhood he was standing in, knelt down on the concrete, unbothered by dust, and took the frayed laces of her worn shoes into his hands. The world seemed to pause as his fingers, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts and handling the finest luxuries, carefully threaded those old laces, tugging them into neat loops with patience, as though there was nothing more important in that moment. Gasps rippled through the children. Some even exchanged wide-eyed looks, as if trying to comprehend how a man of such stature could humble himself like this. "There," he said softly, tying a perfect bow, looking up into her eyes at last. And that was when he noticed something that struck him deeply, though he couldn't quite place why. Something about the girl's face, her quiet strength beneath, the tears, her steady gaze fighting against the pain of humiliation, unsettled him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He smiled, not the smile of pity but of encouragement, the kind that says you are seen, you are worth more than their laughter. And in that second, as children stood frozen, their mocking gone, nobody realized that this simple act was the beginning of a story that would unravel secrets, challenge destinies, and shake the lives of everyone involved. For when a billionaire stoops to tie a little girl's shoelaces, the world takes notice. But the real shock was yet to come, because who she really was would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about life, family, and the fragile strings of fate that tie us all together. The girl stared at the man as if trying to understand why he would do such a thing, why someone like him would lower himself to a ground that others treated like dirt just to tie the shoes she had been mocked for. Her eyes glistened, not just from the sting of tears, but from confusion, because for the first time that day someone hadn't looked at her with ridicule or pity, but with a strange kind of respect. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she simply whispered a thank you so faint that only he could hear it. The man gave her a reassuring nod and slowly rose to his feet, brushing the dust from his knees, though he didn't seem to care about the state of his suit. The children who had been mocking her only moments ago now stood in uneasy silence, their heads lowered as if ashamed of what they had done. One of the boys kicked the ground nervously, while another girl bit her lip, realizing how small their laughter seemed in the face of what had just happened. "Be kind," the man said, his voice calm but firm, his words carrying the weight of someone who knew that kindness could cut deeper than cruelty if delivered with conviction. He gave the circle of children a long look, the type that made even the boldest of them shrink back, before he turned his gaze once more to the girl. "What's your name?" he asked, but the girl hesitated, her lips pressing together as if revealing her identity was something dangerous, something she wasn't ready for. She looked down at her tied shoes, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her skirt, and finally murmured a single name, barely above a whisper. "The Billionaire," repeated it softly, tasting the sound of it, and for a moment he froze, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. The name stirred something in his memory, like a half-forgotten melody that resurfaces when you least expect it. He didn't press her further, though. Instead, he simply gave her a smile and told her she should hold her head high, that nobody had the right to make her feel small. With that, he turned and began to walk away, but something in him resisted the idea of leaving her behind. He felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to know more about her, about why that simple name had shaken something inside him. He paused at the gate, glancing back, and saw her still sitting there, staring after him with wide eyes, as if equally torn between relief and suspicion. The other children began to scatter, whispering among themselves, their earlier cruelty forgotten but replaced with hushed speculation about the man in the suit and why he had paid attention to the girl. Some claimed he must have been her relative, while others laughed nervously, saying maybe he just felt sorry for her. Yet beneath their chatter, an unspoken truth hung heavy. They had witnessed something that didn't make sense to them, something they could not easily explain. The girl, however, felt her heart pounding in her chest in a way that frightened her. She had been taught to keep her distance from people like him, taught that her life was built on secrets too fragile to be exposed. But as she glanced down at her shoelaces, now neatly tied, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, fate had chosen to cross their paths for a reason far bigger than either of them could see. And as the billionaire walked toward his car parked on the other side of the street, his driver waiting patiently, he carried with him a question that gnawed at his mind. Why did that name sound so familiar, and why did it feel like he had just tied the laces of destiny itself, binding himself to a story that was only beginning that night? Long after he had left the dusty schoolyard behind, the billionaire sat in his study, a room filled with towering shelves of books he rarely had time to read, polished oak furniture that gleamed under the soft light of a chandelier, and walls decorated with paintings that told the story of his success in ways words never could. Yet despite the luxury surrounding him, his mind was unsettled. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as the name the girl had whispered replayed again and again in his memory, echoing through the silence of his house. It wasn't just any name. It was a name he had heard before, many years ago, during a chapter of his life he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He leaned back in his leather chair, closing his eyes, and for a moment he was no longer the powerful man who owned companies and commanded boardrooms, but a much younger version of himself, standing in a small hospital room where promises had been broken, where choices had been made that still haunted him. He remembered a woman's voice, her words sharp yet trembling with pain, warning him that one day the truth would find its way back into his life, whether he wanted it to or not. He shook his head, pushing the memory aside, telling himself it was impossible that this girl, this child with worn-out shoes and quiet resilience, could have any connection to that buried past. And yet, the thought lingered. He found himself unable to sleep, his thoughts circling back to her eyes. the way they had held a strength that belied her age, the way they reminded him of someone he had once known. The city outside his window buzzed with its usual energy, cars honking, distant voices echoing through the night, but none of it could drown out the silence inside his heart, the silence that felt heavier than ever. The next morning, he instructed his assistant to find out more about the girl, though he couched his request carefully, not wanting to reveal how much it mattered to him. "There was a student," he said casually, "in one of the schools near the South End. I happened to see her being bullied. I just want to make sure she's all right." The assistant raised an eyebrow but nodded, used to her employer's occasional unpredictable interests. Hours later, a file appeared on his desk, thin, sparse, but enough to reveal what he hadn't been prepared for. The girl lived with her grandmother in a modest house on the edge of town, her parents not listed in any of the records. No father, no mother, just a guardian who had taken her in since she was very young. He stared at the file for a long time, his chest tightening as though the paper itself carried the weight of answers he wasn't ready to face. And then, almost against his will, he got into his car and instructed his driver to take him to that neighborhood. The same dusty streets where children played in alleys and laundry hung between buildings like banners of resilience. As he arrived, he saw her again, sitting on the steps of a small porch, humming softly to herself as she tied her shoelaces. This time without trembling, this time with confidence, as though his earlier gesture had given her courage she hadn't known she possessed. He stood watching from a distance, torn between the urge to approach and the fear of what he might discover if he did. Because deep down, beneath the layers of wealth and power that had defined his life, he already suspected the truth, and it terrified him more than any business rival or hostile takeover ever could. This girl was not just a stranger he had helped in a moment of kindness. She was a living echo of a past he had tried to bury, a reminder of a promise broken, and perhaps his own blood. He lingered near the porch longer than he should have, his driver watching him from the car, confused but disciplined enough not to ask questions. The billionaire's heart pounded in a way it hadn't in years, not from stress of business or boardrooms, but from the terrifying weight of recognition. The girl, unaware of his presence, kept humming to herself, her small fingers carefully retying the shoelaces he had once knotted for her, this time succeeding on her own, looping the strings with precision and pulling them tight. It was a simple act, but to him it looked like a declaration, like she was saying she didn't need anyone's pity anymore, that she could carry herself even in a world determined to push her down. For a moment he almost smiled, but the feeling was swallowed by a heaviness that settled in his chest. He turned to walk away, but then the door creaked open behind the girl, and an older woman stepped out, her gray hair tied back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and cautious, scanning the street like someone who had lived too many years watching for threats. She called the girl inside, her voice firm but gentle, and the girl obeyed without complaint, rushing in with a laugh that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the walls of the house. The billionaire stood frozen, because the woman on the porch, the grandmother, wasn't just a stranger. He knew that face, older now, etched with lines of hardship, but unmistakable. Memories crashed into him. Memories of nights spent arguing with that very same woman when she was younger, when she had begged him to do the right thing, to take responsibility, to choose integrity over reputation. He had walked away back then, convinced that his future was too bright to be tied down by obligations he hadn't wanted to claim. And now here she was, decades later, raising a girl whose name still haunted his mind, a girl who might very well be the living embodiment of his greatest mistake. His throat went dry as the grandmother's eyes fell on him, narrowing as recognition dawned. For a tense moment, neither moved, the weight of unspoken history thick between them. Finally, she turned sharply and went inside, shutting the door, with a finality that told him she wanted no part of his sudden interest. He stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling more powerless than he had in years. For all his billions, for all his influence, he couldn't buy back the years he had abandoned, couldn't erase the choices that had led to this quiet house at the edge of town. He climbed back into his car, silent as his driver pulled away. But inside, his thoughts roared like a storm. He had spent his life controlling outcomes, orchestrating deals, and bending circumstances to his will, but this was different. This was fate dragging him back to confront the past, whether he wanted to or not. And as the car moved through the narrow streets, he realized he wasn't just haunted by the possibility that the girl was connected to him. He was consumed by the question of what kind of person she was becoming, what kind of life she had lived without him, and whether it was too late to make things right. But the grandmother's eyes, cold and defiant, warned him that re-entering their lives would not be as simple as tying a shoelace. If he wanted answers, if he wanted redemption, he would have to face truths that money could never shield him from, truths that might expose him in ways he had never allowed the world to see. That night, he found no peace. His mansion, with its sprawling halls and glittering chandeliers, felt emptier than ever. He had built his empire on control, on the belief that with enough power and wealth, every variable in life could be managed, every storm weathered, every obstacle bought off or eliminated. Yet here he was, sitting alone in the quiet darkness of his private study, staring at an old photograph he had pulled from a locked drawer in his desk, a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. It was faded now, its corners bent, but the faces in it were unmistakable. A much younger version of himself stood beside a woman with fierce eyes and a smile that hid her pain. And in the background, the same woman who now raised the girl, her sister, her protector, stared at the camera with suspicion, even back then. He had kept the photograph hidden because it reminded him of a time when he had chosen ambition over responsibility, pride over humility. He had convinced himself that he had done what was necessary to rise above the weight of expectation, that severing ties with that part of his life was the only way to succeed. But now, seeing the girl's eyes flash in his memory, the truth gnawed at him. Success had come at a price, and that price might very well have been his own flesh and blood. He poured himself a drink, though the liquor burned his throat without offering comfort, and asked himself a question he had long avoided. What if she really was his daughter? The thought alone sent a shiver through him. He thought of the way she had sat there on the school steps, shoulders hunched against the cruelty of children, too proud to cry, too determined to let them see her break. That quiet strength mirrored something he had always admired in her mother, the woman he had once loved but abandoned. Could traits like that be inherited? Could blood carry not just the shape of a face, but the resilience of a spirit? He didn't know, but the idea terrified him. For once in his life, he couldn't calculate the outcome, couldn't predict the consequences, couldn't put it into a chart or a balance sheet. All he knew was that he couldn't stay away. The next morning, he found himself once again near the neighborhood, his luxury car parked discreetly at the corner, far enough that no one would immediately notice, but close enough that he could watch as the girl walked to school with a worn backpack slung over her shoulder. She walked quickly, her head held higher than the day before, her shoelaces tied neatly. He felt a strange surge of pride, absurd for a man who had done nothing to raise her, nothing to guide her. When other children approached, he tensed, waiting for them to mock her again, but to his surprise they kept their distance, whispering to each other instead of laughing openly. Perhaps his presence on the playground had left its mark, or perhaps the girl's quiet dignity was finally beginning to command the respect she deserved. Either way, he could see that she was not as alone as before. But still, he knew the shadow of truth loomed large. The grandmother had recognized him. He was certain of it. And that recognition meant that sooner or later, confrontation would come. He dreaded it yet longed for it. Because if the girl truly was his, if fate had delivered her back into his life after all these years, then maybe, just maybe, he still had a chance to do something right, even if it was decades too late. Yet he also knew the cost. Opening that door could unravel his carefully guarded reputation, expose the secrets he had buried, and force him to face the pain of the woman he had wronged. As he watched the girl disappear into the school gates, his chest tightened with the weight of choice. For a man who had always believed there was nothing he couldn't control, he suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of something larger than himself, something he could neither predict nor command. And in that realization, he felt fear. Not the fear of failure in business, but the fear of a father who might finally have to face the truth of what he had left behind. Days passed, but the question in his heart only grew heavier. He tried to bury himself in work, to drown his thoughts in meetings, contracts, and numbers that had always given him a sense of control. But nothing seemed to quiet the storm inside. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. The girl on the steps with untied shoelaces, the defiant tilt of her chin even when mocked, the fire hidden beneath her quiet tears. He could not escape the thought that destiny had drawn their paths together not by accident, but by some invisible force demanding he answer for the life he had ignored. One evening, after dismissing his assistants earlier than usual, he sat alone in the vast silence of his dining hall, the long table set for 20, though he dined alone. His fork scraped against his plate, but he could not bring himself to eat. He pushed the food away and instead stared at the empty chairs, chairs that seemed to mock him with all the family he had never built, all the bonds he had sacrificed at the altar of wealth. His phone buzzed with a message from his driver, reminding him of an early flight for an international meeting the next morning, but he ignored it. Instead, he rose abruptly and left the mansion, instructing the driver to head toward the small neighborhood once again. He didn't know why he was drawn there night after night. It was as though the quiet streets had become a mirror reflecting everything he had lost. When he arrived, the house was dark except for a dim light glowing through a window. He stood outside, hidden in the shadows, and for the first time in years, he felt like an intruder in his own story. He could see the girl sitting at a small table inside, her head bent over schoolwork, her lips moving silently as she read to herself. The grandmother sat nearby, knitting with slow, steady movements, her eyes occasionally lifting to watch the girl with a love that needed no words. The sight struck him harder than he expected. It wasn't grand, it wasn't luxurious, but it was home. It was the kind of warmth money could never buy, the kind of bond he had chased away when he had chosen ambition over love. His throat tightened as he realized that everything he had accumulated, the mansions, the cars, the private jets, meant nothing compared to the simple glow of that small room. He turned to leave, but as he did, the grandmother's gaze shifted toward the window. Their eyes met across the distance, and this time she did not look away. She rose slowly, setting her knitting aside, and walked to the door. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet night as she stepped outside, her arms crossed over her chest. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp, every syllable laced with years of buried resentment. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like the young man he had once been, standing before her judgment decades ago. "I just wanted to see her," he admitted softly. The grandmother shook her head, her expression hardening. "You had your chance. You chose yourself instead. Don't come back here thinking you can undo the past with a few visits." Her words cut deep, but he did not retreat. "Is she," he began, his voice faltering, "is she mine?" The grandmother's eyes blazed, and for a moment he thought she might strike him. Instead, she whispered, "That child doesn't need a man who abandoned her. She has me. She has everything she needs." Then she turned and slammed the door, leaving, Him in the night once more. He stood there, shaking, his heart hammering as if it might break free of his chest. He had faced ruthless competitors, governments, even scandals in the media, but nothing had ever shaken him like those words. And yet, beneath the sting, there was something else, something undeniable. If she wasn't his, the woman would have said so. Her silence was its own answer, and it tore him apart. For the first time in his life, he realized he could not buy his way out of this truth. He would have to earn it. The following weeks were some of the most difficult of his life. The billionaire who had once commanded entire industries with a single phone call now found himself powerless in the face of one simple truth, that no fortune could erase the past, no amount of wealth could buy forgiveness, and no influence could guarantee a place in the heart of a child he had never known. He continued to return to the neighborhood, sometimes parking blocks away just to watch her walk to school, sometimes lingering at the corner when she laughed with a classmate or carried home groceries with her grandmother. Each glimpse pulled him deeper into the storm of regret and longing that consumed him, each day convincing him further that she was indeed his daughter. But more than that, he saw the resilience in her, the way she carried herself with quiet strength despite the hardships etched into her young life, and he realized that she was already far more powerful than he had ever been at her age. It terrified him and filled him with pride all at once. He wanted to approach her, to explain everything, to tell her who he was and why he had come. But every time he tried, the words stuck in his throat. He feared the rejection, the hatred, the rightful anger she might feel if she discovered the truth too soon. And so he waited, each day battling between courage and cowardice, between the instinct to protect his reputation and the desperate need to be part of her world. Then came the day when fate forced his hand. The girl had been walking home from school when a group of older boys, bigger and meaner than the ones who had mocked her shoelaces, cornered her near the alley behind the market. Their voices were sharp, their laughter cruel, and though she tried to walk past with dignity, one of them shoved her, sending her books tumbling to the ground. She stood tall, refusing to cry, but it was clear she was outnumbered. And then, without hesitation, the billionaire stepped forward. He had been watching from across the street, and in that moment, instinct overpowered fear. His voice thundered through the alley, demanding they leave her alone, and the boys froze, suddenly recognizing the authority in his tone, the fire in his eyes. They scattered, muttering excuses, leaving her standing among her fallen books. She bent to pick them up, her hands trembling, but before she could gather them all, he knelt once again, just as he had the first time, and helped her. Their eyes met, and this time she didn't look away. "Why do you keep helping me?" she whispered, her voice filled with suspicion and wonder. He swallowed hard, the truth rising in his chest like a tide he could no longer hold back. "Because I should have been there from the beginning," he admitted, his voice breaking. She frowned, confused, but something in his tone told her this was bigger than a kind stranger's concern. The grandmother arrived moments later, her face pale with panic, and when she saw him kneeling beside the girl again, she froze. The girl looked between them, sensing the weight of a secret too heavy to remain buried. "What's going on?" she demanded, her small voice sharper now, demanding answers. The grandmother's lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears she had held back for years. The billionaire rose slowly, his heart hammering, knowing there was no turning back. "You deserve the truth," he said softly, looking directly at the girl. "You deserve to know who you are." The air felt charged, the world narrowing to that single moment. The grandmother closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, and finally nodded. The girl's breath caught, her eyes widening, as though she already knew what he was about to say but couldn't quite believe it. And then, with a trembling voice, he spoke the words that would change everything. I am your father." Silence fell heavy, the kind of silence that carries the weight of generations, of choices and regrets and promises broken. The girl's face shifted between shock, confusion, and something deeper, a flicker of recognition, as though part of her had always sensed this truth. The grandmother wept quietly, the burden of secrecy finally lifted, though her eyes still burned with anger at the man who had taken so long to return. And he, the billionaire who had once thought himself untouchable, stood exposed, vulnerable, and utterly human, waiting for the judgment that only this child could deliver. She stared at him for a long time, her small hands clutching the books. He had helped her gather and finally whispered, "Then why weren't you there?" The question shattered him, more painful than any loss he had ever endured, but he didn't look away. "Because I was a coward," he admitted, his voice heavy with truth. "But I am here now, and if you'll let me, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I should never have left." Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. For once, he allowed himself to be seen not as a titan of industry, but as a man stripped bare of excuses. The girl's lips quivered, her eyes filling with tears, and though she didn't speak, she didn't turn away. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was hope. And for him, that was enough. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't ending. It was only just beginning.